Picture this. You're a psychologist during the Vietnam War. Your job? To come up with psychological strategy to win the war. No pressure, right? Except you stress yourself out so much that you start losing it. Now fast forward to the 1700s. You're a colonist trekking through southern Africa, meeting people you don't understand, treating them terribly, and, oh wait, confused yet? Good. Let me tell you about a book that takes these wildly different stories, smashes them together, and somehow makes you question humanity, war, and, well, yourself. This is Dusklands by Coetzee. My first dive into the work of a Nobel Prize winner, and I promise it did not disappoint. Buckle up because we're about to explore two stories that are as unsettling as they are thought-provoking. But hey, at least one of them has a psychological breakdown to keep things spicy. Dusklands is actually two stories in one: the Vietnam Project and the narrative of Jacobus Coetzee. Let's tackle them one at a time, starting with the psychological war zone of the first story. In the Vietnam Project, we meet Eugene Dawn, a psychologist tasked with creating a propaganda strategy for the Vietnam War. Eugene is that guy who overthinks everything. His boss, also named Coetzee, but no relation to the author, pushes him to revise his work, and poor Eugene spirals into a mental breakdown. The guy's literally cracking under the pressure, questioning his sanity, his work, and basically life itself. Honestly, it's like watching someone argue with themselves on Twitter but in the 70s. The brilliance of this story lies in its commentary on war. It's not just the soldiers who suffer, it's the strategists, the thinkers, and anyone caught in the chaos. Eugene's unraveling is a reminder that war's casualties aren't always physical. Heavy, right? But wait, the second story cranks up the existential dread even more. Now let's travel back to 1760 for the narrative of Jacobus Coetzee. This guy, Jacobus, is a colonist exploring southern Africa. Picture him rolling into Namaqua territory with his cattle, slaves, and a head full of entitlement. He hands out gifts like copper and tobacco, expecting the locals to be impressed. Spoiler alert, they're not. Jacobus thinks the Namaqua people are barbarians. But here's the twist. He's the real savage. After they nurse him back to health during an illness, he repays their kindness with, you guessed it, violence. He goes full revenge mode, killing his former slaves and others he deems beneath him. It's brutal, it's horrifying, and yet it's all too human. So, what's the point of these two stories? Well, Coetzee doesn't hold your hand or spoon-feed you answers. Instead, he forces you to confront uncomfortable truths. In the Vietnam Project, you see how war breaks people from the inside out. In the narrative of Jacobus Coetzee, you're faced with colonialism at its ugliest, dehumanization, violence, and the rewriting of history to erase atrocities. Oh, and here's a fun fact. Even in the book's afterword and appendix, the colonial massacres are conveniently omitted, as if those lives didn't matter. Subtle, right? What really struck me is Coetzee's writing style. It's terse, sharp, and sometimes unsettlingly distant. The plots aren't tight and the climaxes don't explode. They simmer. And yet the stories stick with you. You're left thinking about humanity's capacity for cruelty and how history is written by those in power. Let's talk about the man behind the words, Coetzee. Born in South Africa, he's a Nobel Prize-winning author known for tackling heavy themes like colonialism, power, and morality. Dusklands was his debut work, and it's clear even here that he's not afraid to challenge his readers. This isn't a book you'll read and forget. It's a book that lingers. So, would I recommend Dusklands? Absolutely, but with a caveat. This isn't light reading. It's thought-provoking, disturbing, and at times uncomfortable. But if you're up for a challenge and want to explore stories that dig deep into the human condition, give it a shot. Thanks for joining me on this journey through Dusklands. If you've read it, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't, what's stopping you? Until next time, happy reading, and maybe rethink how you define savage.